Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? This mic good. Welcome to Perry World House. I am Marie Harf, our executive director here. I have the privilege of introducing our speakers today, and as a way of doing so, I'm going to start with a brief story for you. Before I came to Penn, I worked at Georgetown University, where one of the things I did was help run our commencement graduation ceremonies. 3 years ago, we made a somewhat unique decision to honor the sacrifice and heroism of political prisoners by hearing from 3 either prisoners or family members of prisoners as our commencement speakers. An interesting choice, right? We started with remarks from Deborah Tice, the mother of Georgetown graduate Austin Tice, a journalist held captive in Syria while reporting on the war, who was later killed. We then heard from Dasha Navalnaya, the daughter of Russian dissident Alexei Navalny, a political prisoner who was later murdered by the Putin regime. Finally, we heard from someone who himself had been a political prisoner and who had survived things that many, I might say most in his position, don't ever survive. A pastor and an activist in Zimbabwe who sparked a movement that gathered hundreds of thousands against Mugabe's brutal dictatorship. That person, of course, is our speaker today, Evan Mawarire. For his work, Evan was imprisoned, tortured, and charged with treason, facing 80 years in prison. The incredible story that he recounted that day, which left the audience of graduates and their families and friends in awe. It left them in tears, and it finally ended in a standing ovation. That story is what he is here to tell today. As global democracy faces mounting threats, Evan's memoir, Crazy Epic Courage, which many of you I hope were able to get as you walked in, explores the intersections of activism, faith, and courage in the fight for human rights and democratic accountability. His story offers a rare and urgent firsthand perspective on the power of ordinary citizens to fight for dignity and freedom. We are so looking forward to hearing his words of wisdom today, just as we did when he served as a distinguished visiting fellow at Perry World House a few years ago. Moderating this conversation will be award-winning documentary filmmaker, fine art photographer, author, and Perry World House faculty fellow, Peter DeCherney. He holds the Edmund J. and Louise W. Kahn Endowed Chair in the Humanities at the University of Pennsylvania, where he is a professor of cinema and media studies and director of the Penn Global Documentary Institute. Peter has worked for a long time in various countries in Africa, making films about global migration, the political role of artists, and African Jewish communities. His films in production include a documentary about the Lemba Jewish community in Zimbabwe and South Africa. Now, without further ado, please help me welcome our speakers to the stage.
Hey everyone, thanks for coming out. Thank you, Marie. As Marie hinted at, I actually just returned from Zimbabwe a few weeks ago. And I was thinking about something that Monroe Price, a former Penn professor, had said when I was in China. I was there directing a program, and I would write him every day about what I was encountering and my thoughts. And he wrote back, if China is starting to make sense to you, then you need to see more China. And I think that, that's clearly was true of Zimbabwe. And I think it's true of every country in the world. Right, they're full of contradictions. Zimbabwe was incredibly beautiful. I met so many, lovely people, despite the fact that there's skyrocketing unemployment. Everyone was working. I was hoping you could just give us a little sense of what it was like in the early 2010s, living under Mugabe. What are the kind of larger political influences that started to really change the country? And then what was it like just your lived experience?
Well, first of all, Peter, thanks very much for taking the time and agreeing to, kind of moderate this conversation. And I'm just excited that, you took some time to go to Zimbabwe as well and to kind of experience what Zimbabwe is like. And thanks to all of you guys for showing up today. I was a bit surprised when we were walking up there, and I'm like, wait, there's a lot of people here. What did you tell everybody? This was about. Hope you told them the truth. But Zimbabwe is like many places, is a place that's had its fair share of trying to figure itself out. Maybe a little bit deeper in terms of the brutality of some of the experiences that have happened there. Um, and when you look back on maybe the sense of Zimbabwe being a better country or being a freer country, a lot of it is framed by the history of one man in particular, Robert Mugabe, whom you mentioned, who became Prime Minister of Zimbabwe in 1980 when Zimbabwe got independence from British colonial rule, and remained as head of government and state, and then became executive president and remained in power for another 36 years up until around about 2016, maybe 2017. And so being in power for 37 years means that that country had stopped being a democracy, though we had certain aspects of a democracy where we had elections regularly. Those elections were not fair. They were not free and fair. They were not run in the way that a democracy would run the elections. Particularly, I think the thing that shaped the way people in Zimbabwe related to the political space was the fear of being brutalized. And I'll sort of give you, a few examples of what shaped the culture of fear that became a part of Zimbabwean citizenry and that began to dictate how Zimbabweans participate in their quote unquote democracy. In the early 80s, Robert Mugabe, in the south of the country, just after we'd gotten independence, unleashed a brutal wave of killings where it's estimated, that over 20,000 people were murdered in it was almost like an ethnic cleansing exercise, where he feared that people from the Ndebele tribe, which is a different tribe that Robert Mugabe was from, he feared that they would vote him out of power at some point and they would choose their candidate and put him in power. And over 20,000 people were murdered during that time. And yet the world still considered Zimbabwe a democracy and still considered Zimbabwe, a new country that was apparently doing well. And the world was kind of willing to turn a blind eye to these murders that were happening, in the South. And so as time progressed, Robert Mugabe's confidence in brutalizing his own countrymen grew. And that came with the mismanagement of the country entirely, of the resources the country had. The corruption skyrocketed. We saw this particularly begin to show through in the early 90s, about 10, 12 years after independence. And we began to have the devaluation of our currency to the point that, much later on, I think in the early 2000s, I remember a case where Robert Mugabe admitted that $15 billion US dollars worth of revenue collected from the diamonds mined in the country had vanished from the treasury. And that was just it. He just said, well, there's $15 billion that's missing. And that was it. No one was ever held accountable for that. No questions were ever asked. And for a country the size of the economy was about maybe $3.5 billion at the time, to have $15 billion of diamond revenue go missing, that's catastrophic. But that would get even worse. As difficult as it may be to understand how could it get worse. It did get worse. The violence against people got worse, where again people were murdered when it came to the retaliation politically. When we would go to elections and people would vote against Robert Mugabe, the areas that voted against him would be punished. One of those punishments, I'll give you an idea of what they look like, is something that they called long sleeve, short sleeve. And it was a punishment in which the area in which people had huge numbers vote against Robert Mugabe were given a choice where their arm was chopped off at the wrist or at the elbow. So that's the long sleeve, short sleeve aspect. And the idea was, let that missing limb be a reminder of of where you should vote with your remaining limb in the next election. And for those that still have both arms, let the sight of that individual or those individuals remind you that that could happen to you. So those are some of the things that shaped Zimbabwe's kind of culture of how people engage with the politics. I mean, when we then get to places like 2008, where the economic crash happened and our inflation was running at 286 million% per year. 280, and that's conservative, by the way. It's actually measured to have gone, I believe, as far as about 500 and something million% per annum. The largest banknote was a $100 trillion note, and that wasn't enough to buy a loaf of bread. And so that kind of wounding, it's a wounding to people. It does something to your own sense of hope, to your own sense of, do I even have any power at all? Like, can anyone even change and turn this around? And so when we start to agitate.
So actually, even before that, before we get to what it was like to be an adult and have a family in that situation, you talk really beautifully in the book about growing up under Mugabe and in being in school, and you still had faith in the system, and you were even the student president.
Oh yeah, I mean, when you're as a young child, and the state propaganda throws at you the pictures of Robert Mugabe as being kind of the liberator, which he and a group of people, a generation, they were liberators, because colonialism had brought us to a place where Black people were not allowed to do certain things in their own country. You were not allowed to vote. You were not allowed to own property unless you had permission from your either your white employer or someone who favored you. You were not allowed to come into the city without a note from the authorities. Ian Smith, who was the last prime minister of Rhodesia, as it was called back then, had famously made the statement that Black majority rule would never be a thing in Zimbabwe. And as in his statement, he said, not in 1,000 years. And that was in about 1970, I think 1977 or 1978 that he said that, maybe 79. And just a few years later, independence came to Zimbabwe. So Robert Mugabe was this heroic figure. He was this liberator. Him and that generation of people were people we emulated. I looked up to Robert Mugabe as a young boy. And as you rightly mentioned, I do tell a story in there where, when I was 16, I actually became the child president of Zimbabwe. And this is a bit of a weird little twist of fate, because I had no interest in participating in this event. But what would happen is that, and you'll read the story a little bit more in the book, was that Zimbabwe hosted this children's parliament every year. And as part of Day of the African Child, which celebrates students who were murdered in South Africa at the time, in about 1977, 1978, I think it was. And so in commemoration of these high school students who had protested the apartheid regime and had been brave enough to do so, Zimbabwe hosts this children's parliament. And the idea is trying to bring young people to a place of having a sense of responsibility for their nation, of being involved and kind of being active. So I took part in that, and was subsequently elected as the child president of the Republic of Zimbabwe, from in 1993, 1994. And one of the coolest aspects about that is that you get to meet Robert Mugabe. And on that particular day, he was out of the country on a state visit somewhere, and I was gutted. Because I would have loved to meet this man. Like, come on, the president and me playing president, like, this would have been so cool. And I guess, had you told me that 23 years later, the same man whom I was dying to shake hands with and have a picture with, and whom I was emulating on that day, 23 years later, that man would hunt me down, ban me from the country, and threaten to kill me, I'd never have believed you.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing in the book when you reflect back on telling that story. and how empty the things that you valued at the time, how empty they seemed in retrospect, and how that made you think about the sham elections and just the pomp and circumstance that was probably meaningless to Mugabe and his fellows. Okay, so fast forward, and you're an adult living under Mugabe, trying to raise a family.
Yep.
What was the day like day to day, and then how did that lead you to take action?
The
Really to be
realization,
drawn into taking action, I should say.
well, the realization as an adult, you start to obviously understand that, wait, there's something very wrong with the kind of society we're living in, because you're watching every generation of people who you call the adults, you're watching them not only struggle but lose hope with their own country. And the dream that they have is that they can have just enough money to send their children out of the country. And they're saying, you know what? There's nothing for you here. I'd rather you go to school in South Africa. I'd rather you go to school in Australia. I'd rather you get to the United States. And when you get there, don't come back. I mean, there's enough students who will tell you this from my generation and even the generation after me that will tell you as young Zimbabweans that their parents have said, we will be fine. Figure it out over there, but don't come back here because there's nothing for you here. And so you start to understand as an adult why. It's because they've come to the end of their own agency or their realization that there's very little we can do about it. There's no more hope here. And so I'm a parent now. This is 2016. And it's different from the economic crash of 2008, where though I had just been married, I didn't have any kids yet. And, my wife and I, were able to kind of maneuver around really quickly. In fact, we left the country for a couple of years and we were based in England for a couple of years after that, and then made the decision to go back because I remember saying to her, I really feel like we have a role to play back home in Zimbabwe. And my job at the time had become as a pastor. I was now pastoring a church, and that's what I'd given my life to. And so going back to Zimbabwe, even though it would have been better to stay out because of what was happening there economically, was more of a mission of what kind of contribution can we make back into our own country. But it was not with the thought of a political contribution. It was with the thought of how can we go back and help young people to think differently about what they can do for themselves, about what they can contribute to their own country. How can we help shift the mindset? In fact, I remember writing a little book that became one of my first books that I wrote, and it was entitled Dream Big and Make It Happen, 50 Reasons Why. That's the book I literally launched back with into Zimbabwe when we went back to Zimbabwe in 2009. But as our small family grows, you start to realize that unless there is a fundamental change in the way the country is governed, we could speak hope all we want, all day. You could motivate people to do better all day. I mean, for as much as you can, but until we have a political environment that actually allows people to thrive and gives people the freedom, as our constitution says. And by the way, we have a constitution that gives Zimbabweans all these amazing rights, but you're not allowed to exercise them. That's the weird thing. So you start to realize that unless we have that kind of a change, we're not going to go anywhere. We're going to keep spinning our wheels in the same place. We're going to keep having the same problems every 8 years. Zimbabwe has an economic crash. So we had one 2008, we had one 2016. We've just had another one in about 2023, and it just keeps happening where people lose everything. And so now it was my turn. And in the book, I talk about this, and I make this comment that I had watched my parents lose everything. 2008, my mom and dad had about $80,000 in the bank, US dollars, as their retirement. And when you live in a small town in Zimbabwe, 80,000 US dollars is a lot of money to retire on. When the crash happened, the government banned people from withdrawing money from the banks. You were not allowed to withdraw money from the banks. You could only withdraw a certain amount after a certain period. And when we were in super hyperinflation, my parents went from having 80,000 US dollars in the bank in 7 days, $80,000 to 25 cents. I'll never forget that as long as I live, because I watched my retired parents sit and try to figure out, what do we do? And of course, we had started helping, taking care of them as they went back onto the job market, and eventually they figured it out and began from scratch. And so here we are, with the family and beginning from scratch. And the realization for me is, I can't just preach sermons and messages anymore to the people. I have to say something to the people that are in power.
Yeah.
And
So
that's
what's
where
the
it begins.
catalyst that caused you to make a video that really changed things for
It
you?
was very personal. It was very personal, by the way. And I think this is where my perspective comes from, of, if you're going to do anything meaningful, if you're going to be part of change that's meaningful, it has to start off, first of all, being personal. How does this affect you personally? And it was a day in which I, for the first time in my adult life, and as a dad and as a husband, a day in which I did not know where our meal was going to come from the next day. We had come to the end of the money that we had. Some of it had been eroded by the money losing value. And now we had burned through the last amount that we had. We had had that the last amount of food we had in the house was gone. And I was literally sitting in my church office trying to figure out, where are we going to get money for food for tomorrow? And it's a scary thought, Peter, that it's one thing to not be able to not have a car, right? It's one thing to say, well, we can't make this journey to go because we don't have enough money for air tickets or for bus. It's another thing to say, I don't have enough money for food. That is a scary thought. And so that's where that begins for me, where the realization is, I should not be having this kind of a problem. I'm fairly well educated, fairly well connected. I work hard. I'm honest. I shouldn't be in this position. And it's leading me back. When I trace this problem to its root, it goes back to the fact that this country, a place where a Zimbabwean like me should be thriving, should be doing well, because home is where you should do well. It's leading me back to the fact that it is those in power, it is those who are governing the country that have run it to the ground, to the point where they steal from us, they thrive, and they do well, and we suffer. So that was the point at which I sat in my church office, and I took my phone out, and I remember this clearly, and I remember propping it up against my Bible in my church office. And I recorded this 4-minute video, which was, more than anything else, was a rant. I was just upset and didn't know who else to talk to, didn't know what else to say to who. They are no, when you have no doors to knock on to complain about something, sometimes the only, and it makes you look like you're losing your mind. The only thing you have left is just to yell into the atmosphere and just hope someone hears you. And that's what happened with that little 4-minute video that eventually went viral. It was me just saying, I'm an ordinary Zimbabwean. I'm a dad, I'm a husband, and I'm struggling, and I don't know what else to do. And I need to know whether anyone else feels this way. And I also need to call us to action to say that no one is coming to save us. We have to figure out how we're going to do this.
Yeah. So one of the keys to the video and to the movement it led to was your thinking about your reflections on the Zimbabwean flag. What if you talk to us just about what the flag meant to you, and then how you use the flag as a symbol? You gave it a new kind of power.
That's a good question. Again, it was spontaneous, very unplanned. And I find it interesting that when I then read, and by the way, I'm not an academic. I'm an ordinary dude that that really wanted to do something for their country. And I find it amazing that that has been studied. I've read some studies on it, and I'm like, I never would have thought this. This is an amazing research. But the way that happened was that the Zimbabwe flag happened to be in my office. at the time when I was getting ready to make this video. And in the middle of the video, I grabbed the Zimbabwe flag and I began to talk about the meaning of the flag. And I go back to when I was in primary school and I was like 7, 8, 9, 10 years old, and they would teach us about the meaning of the Zimbabwe flag, the different colors, right? And so if you look at the Zimbabwe flag, it has the green band, the yellow band, the red band, and the black band, and then the colors repeat on the other side, going to the other side of the flag. And they would teach us the meaning of these things, and it was kind of part of educating a generation of young people about the history of Zimbabwe and why people went to war and things like that, to fight for freedom. And it was great because it gave us a sense of national pride, and it also gave us a sense of vision. So the green stood for, Zimbabwe's agricultural, economic strength. We were known for amazing produce. The yellow stood for the minerals in the ground. If you know anything about Zimbabwe, there's diamonds, there's lithium, there's platinum, there's silver, there's all sorts of things. The red stood for the blood that was shed in the war of liberation. And of course, just how much we have to remember those that stood up for our freedom. And then the black stood for the national majority of Black people who were now able to enjoy the national cake, who could now be part of the national conversation, right? And it struck me sitting in that office as I recited the colors of the flag and the meaning, how every single part of that flag, the promise it made to me as a Zimbabwean, as a young Zimbabwean, as an older Zimbabwean, the promise it made to people that went to the war, how everything in that flag, that promise had been broken. That promise had essentially become a lie. And that's one thing that I actually say in the video. And it was a rant. There are times I go back to that video and watch it and I think, oh my gosh, what was I smoking? But I think it became the rallying point that said, it doesn't matter what your political affiliation is. You and I have a vision. We have a promise that was made to us. That promise has been broken. And every day that this flag flies, if you watch the video, I actually say every day that this flag flies, it's begging for you. It's calling for you to come and save it. It's calling for you to come and restore the original meaning of what it meant. So that became a central point that was able to unite people of different persuasions. And really by a stroke of luck, it allowed this what became a movement to become something that was nonpartisan, but to become something that was for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, clearly your rant was also echoing what everyone else was thinking and not saying, and that's what they connected with. And then, yeah, people rallied around you and started a movement. But then you had to keep making decisions about what to do as a leader, this role you were thrust into. How did you decide what to do next? How did you decide to stage protests or decide to have people wrap themselves in the flag, or any of these decisions, which really spoke to people and then caused a kind of grassroots movement?
I'm kind of laughing because I must tell you that there were many points at which I tried to shut this whole thing down, because it was getting scary, and because it was not my plan to be doing this. This was not something I wanted to be part of. And also because I had a wife who, every time I got back home, she was like, "What are you doing?" And particularly because we had a 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and she was pregnant with our third one. So yeah, even I would ask myself the question, are you crazy? What on earth are you doing? So a number of times I actually tried to stop this thing and get out of it. And I'll tell you a funny story about this, which was not funny at the time, but it's funny when I look back on it. So when the first video goes viral, I am panicking, because I used to do videos before. These were kind of like my teaching videos for our church. And those videos used to have 5 to 8 views every 3 weeks, right? But now I'm sitting here with this video that has 200,000 views in 24 hours. And I'm panicking, and there are these comments coming in that vary from, wow, this is amazing, to, wow, you're going to pay the price. And so I'm panicking, and I call this friend of mine who is a PR specialist, and I say to him, dude, you have to help me. I don't know what to do. He says to me, no problem, Ivan, here's what we're going to do very quickly. You're going to record a second video. In the video, you're going to clean up everything you said in the first video. You're going to tell them what you were not saying. You're going to, be a little bit more pointed, and you're going to distance yourself from anything that sounds remotely like you were challenging the government. I'm like, okay, good, let's do it. We make a second video. And as the video is coming to an, at the end of the video, I say, however, I'm not backing away from the fact that we have problems in this country that need to be addressed, that people are suffering and people are finding it difficult to just live simply on a daily basis. So we need you guys to do something about it. We put that video out. That video goes more viral than the first one. So this guy says to me, don't worry about it, Ivan, easy fix. Let's make a third video that cleans up what you were saying. Long story short, we end up making 4 videos trying to clean this thing up, and the thing keeps growing. And I think that's when I make the decision. I remember sitting in my office and feeling like this is more than just a set of videos going viral. I think there's a moment here. I think this is I've often said there are journeys that there are journeys we pick for ourselves, and then there are journeys that pick you. And I felt like this was a moment that was picking me, no matter how much I tried to break loose of it. And so I make a decision that I'm going to lean into this, and just allow it to get to its natural end, which in my mind, I expected the natural end was just a couple of days away or just a couple of weeks away. Instead of fight it, just go with the flow, and it'll end. But every time we did something, or every time I said something, this thing seemed to explode even more. And so I remember then when a few friends came to join me, and they said, hey, Ivan, it looks like something is forming here, and we want to try and put a little bit of structure to it. And so we make the decision to go with it. And again, we were not experienced. None of us were politicians. None of us had been activists. We were just ordinary people. And our philosophy became that even though we don't know what we should be doing next, because people kept asking us now, they were excited at this thing, and they're like, so what's next? What are you guys going to do next? What's coming up next? And though we didn't know what was next, the commitment I made was that let's always know what to do now. So we may not know what to do next, but let's know what to do now. And the whole point with that was, let's break this culture of sitting back and saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it. There's always something we can do. Now, what is it we can do now? Because if we know what to do now, my thinking is inevitably we will figure out what we should do next. And so that became the thinking of how we did things. We ended up, the one thing we did by complete accident, we ended up challenging the governor of the Reserve Bank to a debate. And that happened by accident. And I'll tell you the little accident. Feel free to stop me, Peter, because I talk a lot. I can be here until tomorrow. The governor of the Reserve Bank, they're introducing a new currency. And he says a statement. He says, I promise you that if this currency loses value, just a little bit of value, I will quit my job. And he says, that's how confident I am. And I remember it's a friend of mine, his name is Henry, and we sat there, we're like, this is amazing, because it is going to lose value. We know this. It's going to lose value. So then he says, and I'll allow anyone who wants to debate me on the issue to debate me. And so we were like, he's lying. Let's write him a letter, challenge him to a debate. He's going to say no, or he's going to ignore us. We will go back to social media, tell the whole world they're scared, tell the whole world that this is what we've been dealing with. They make promises they can't keep. They will never talk to ordinary people because they're afraid. So we write this letter, we send it off to him, and then we put together our social media campaign, ready to go on the Monday. We sent the letter on a Friday, ready to go on Monday once we didn't hear from him. We were going to go early because we didn't want to give it too much time. On Sunday, the Reserve Bank governor called my phone. And he says, is this Pastor Ivan? I said, yes. He goes, this is the governor of the Reserve Bank. I saw your letter. I'm taking you up on the challenge. Let's do the debate. I remember I called Henry and I said, dude, we have messed up big time because I do not know the first thing about monetary policy. I know nothing. I know nothing about how the economy works. All I know is money that I earn should be enough to buy the things I need to buy, and that's all I know. And we are panicking because now we have this debate. And eventually we set it up in such a way where we invite a whole bunch of people to come to this debate. The governor says to us, I'll only debate you if you come to debate me in the Reserve Bank building. We have an auditorium in the basement. I'm like, oh, come on. In the basement of a government building? Are you kidding me? And Henry says to me, dude, it's now or never. We have to go for it. And so we invite people. Some people write back and they're like, we're not coming. You're going to get us killed. This is nonsense. Ivan, you're a government project. Robert Mugabe sent you to sniff out people who are against him. They're going to kidnap us in the building. And I'm like, guys, like, I don't know what else to say. I'm going to the debate. If you want to be part of it, let's go. And about 300 people show up to this debate and we pack this place out. And we end up having what we still call today is the citizens' coup on the governor, the Reserve Bank governor, because we debated him to his face. We beat him home and away. There was no question about it. End up on the front page of the newspaper the following day because we gave him a token of appreciation, which we encouraged him to open on stage. He didn't know what it was. It was a big frame that we had wrapped up. And as he opened it, we had framed and enlarged the $100 trillion note. And we had written on it, this must never happen to the citizens again. Lest we forget, this must never happen to the citizens again. And so the newspapers carried the next day. And so the movement literally grows to the next level. There's no shutting down. So that was the way we kind of made the decisions up until we got to one of the biggest protests that we had.
Yeah, I mean, you can see Yvonne is an amazing storyteller. This story's in the book. Many others like this are in the book. You downplay the stakes a little bit. You knew this was a really dangerous activity, and as a result, you had multiple times that you were imprisoned. You were at the brink of torture. You were in solitary confinement, and then a really powerful moment is when you and your family were safely out of the country. You chose to go back, knowing you'd go to prison again.
Yeah, again, all of those moments are moments I look back on now, and though I'm glad that we did it, we made the decisions we made. There are moments I sometimes look back on and think, wow, I'm not really sure how we made those decisions. But again, I go back to how personal is something for you. My first arrest came after we had hosted our first national protest. We came to a point where we felt that a lot of people were listening to what we were saying. And by the way, besides the debate, everything else we were doing was videos on Facebook, and Twitter, because you're not allowed to protest in Zimbabwe on the street unless you have permission from the government to protest the government. Duh. And so we hosted these online gatherings and online protests, and that kind of began to change the game for a lot of people that felt like, hey, even if I can't be somewhere physically or with my actual identity, I can be part of it digitally. And that seemed to be meaningful to a lot of people. And so the first protest we hosted, which is again in the book, was the shutdown. And all I did was I recorded a video and I said, look, Zimbabweans, enough is enough. I've made as many videos as I can. I think at that point, I'd probably made close to about 35, maybe 40 different videos, because I'd make a video every single day. And I said, I think we have to do something now. And I'm not asking you to come on the street, because we all know how dangerous that is. But there is something we can do. We could unite in a powerful action, and we could shut this country down by simply staying at home. So on the 6th of July, and I was making this video on the 4th of July, and I said, on the 6th of July, I'm asking you guys to stay at home. Don't go to work, don't take your kids to school, don't open your businesses, don't go on the street, don't go to the supermarket, don't go to the bank, just stay indoors just for one day. Just so that this government gets gets the message loud and clear in terms of who is actually in charge. And I think at that point, even the way I was speaking and my languaging had changed from this ordinary pastor to being kind of this, this figure who seems to have some big plan somewhere, and yet there was still no big plan. We were just going from one action to the next. And in 2 days' time, again, I'll never forget this as long as I live, the whole country came to a complete standstill. It was the 6th of July, and people responded, and they stayed at home. And so I was arrested a couple of days after that, and I was charged with attempting to overthrow the government. I was thrown in a maximum security prison. I was beaten. 2 nights I spent, 2 of the hardest nights. I mean, there were other moments that were quite hard, but that being the first encounter with brutality of the regime was very difficult for me. The stories I had heard of were finally coming true and coming to pass. And it was a very difficult moment. But I always tell about the silver lining in that moment, because all of these things were doing something for Zimbabweans. And the reason I call the book Crazy Epic Courage is that everything we did over this period of time was teaching us how to find our courage and activate our courage and figure out how to do something about the things we care about the most. And so in the morning, 2 days after being in prison, in the morning, we're about to go to court for my trial. A police officer comes to tell me that, hey, there's 200 people gathered at the courts. He says, these people say they're your people, they have flags, they're kneeling and praying, and they won't leave until you're released. I said to him, first of all, they're not my people, because I only have 40 people in my church, because I was scared. I'm like, I don't know who those 200, they're not my people. Are you kidding me? I don't want to get in more trouble than I'm already in. But he comes back an hour later, he says, man, there's about 600 people. Then an hour later, he says, hey, man, there's about 1,000 people. He came back maybe 6 or 7 times between 8 a.m. and 7 p.m. until there were 10,000 people gathered outside. It was easily one of the most amazing moments in this journey. And by the end of the night, after people had refused to go home and the crowd was swelling even bigger, they actually let me go. And that's the night that I escaped Zimbabwe with my family. But a powerful moment, because people took back their power. People who were scared showed up. And of course, once we got to safety and we were here in the US in 2016, my daughter was born soon after we arrived. And I remember saying to my wife, listen, I am sorry that I have brought you into all of this, but I feel like the job is not done. So if you will allow me to go back home to Zimbabwe to continue this work. And, it's kind of funny. I remember her looking at me. She was troubled, and I owe her a lot. And I remember the look she gave me. She didn't say it loudly, but I interpreted the look to be, if you want to die, I will kill you myself. But I took the flight back to Zimbabwe, and I was arrested immediately on arrival at the airport and taken straight back to the maximum security prison. And of course, the hardship continued in the maximum security prison, but also so did these silver linings and these moments in which the movement continued to grow, even as I was held in that maximum security prison. Had incredible, incredible moments that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, no, this is an important point. It's crazy. You have crazy epic courage. You showed it, but also as a whole movement of people that also had that courage. So we have time for a few questions from the audience. We have a microphone over here. Yeah, Carol.
I remember you when you came to Penn, when African international students invited you.
I remember that.
And as I recall, you were allowed to come to America at the cost of your parents maybe losing their house. So
Yes.
if you didn't return, they would take your parents' house away. So I just feel like the enormity of your courage needs to just, how did I remember that? I don't know, it was such a long time ago.
That's actually amazing. And it's so good to see you again, because
Yeah.
that was, I remember that was before I went, that was after there was a release I had, and I needed medical attention, and they said, okay, you can have your passport back, and you can have, but we'll hold the title deeds to your parents'
right.
house. And if you don't come back, they lose their house. And I remember thinking, no, they're not going to lose their house. There's no way. I'm definitely coming back. And so that was a hard decision to make. But I think also at the time, just my thinking had changed around, oh, you think I'm not coming, but like, you think I'm scared of you? No, I'm not. I'm coming back. I mean, I was scared. Don't ever listen to anyone who says I was never scared. No, I was scared the whole time. But something happens when you get a hold of a cause that rarely becomes your life, and that rarely becomes, something that you're committed to. And that's part of what was going on at the time. But yeah, I thank my parents, because my dad said to me, if you get there and you decide you don't want to come back, stay. We'll figure it out. We'll rebuild. But I wasn't willing for them to go through that again.
So I just have a very quick, it's very beautiful, thank you. But a really quick question, because I come out of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa, and my father was a minister, and he was,
I was going to ask, is your accent? I was like,
yeah, so I'm interested in the place of faith in politics. I think even in this country, we're still looking in a way. Sometimes we have Reverend Barber who speaks out about poverty. But what do you think, even speaking to the US in this moment, we always think that Africa is separate, but actually it's not, what's happening here is not, it feels very familiar in so many ways. So I'm interested just in, for you as a pastor, where do you think the place of faith is, or did faith not work? Did you have to go economically and politically?
Oh no, faith definitely worked. And I think this was the beauty of this moment that I was in, is that though I was a regular citizen and a dad and a father, I also happened to be a pastor at the same time. And so there was a resonance with people when I spoke about the need for truth and transparency and justice and compassion, because that was one of my big cries, was, where is your compassion as the leadership of this country? In fact, one of the scriptures that became a central part of my starting point is in Proverbs, in chapter 31, run about verse 8. And it says, speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and defend the rights of those who are weak. Particularly the widows and the orphans. And so that played a big part in Zimbabwe in rallying more and more people, because I think it gave people a sense of safety in following a movement that they knew was not all about the politics and was not all about the power, but was really all about the humanity. Can we restore the humanity? Can we restore the dignity of a people who have lost hope? And I think that's where the beauty of faith is. And I think that's why it's important for faith leaders to maintain the sanctity of that office and not mix it with the political drive, so that you can still have the ability to speak truth to power from this position of kind of moral authority, right? And whether you support them or not, whether you like the people in power or not, the higher call is to be able to hold them accountable when the time arrives. And I think that's the beauty of what we did in Zimbabwe, is that and Zimbabwe being kind of 80% Christian, maybe, some people may argue it's a little less, but being largely Christian, there was a resonance with this position of, I'm not here because I want your power or your office or anything you have. I'm here because we need the dignity of people. We need compassion, for a struggling people. So it played a huge role.
You're gonna hold it? Okay. Thank you so much. It was so inspirational. I just want to ask, like, looking back, what would you have done differently? What opposition strategies were like most helpful, and the ones that were not very helpful? And I want to also ask to activists around the world who are still like resisting authoritarian regimes. Say, I'm from Turkey, and there are a lot of activists still facing political torture. What would you say to them?
What would I have done differently? I think maybe my answer is going to speak to both your questions. I think one of the mistakes, or one of the areas in which we lacked, was not building enough solidarity with other groups or with other voices, because of our fear of how the government had treated all of us. They had taught us to be suspicious of each other. And so we took time to find friends, or to find those that would have been great to be in solidarity with. So I wish we had invested a little bit more in collaborating with other voices, particularly voices that had done the work before us. Because our success was not it didn't grow from its own seed. The work we did thrived because the cultivation of the political space had been done before by people in opposition politics, had been done before by people in civic society. For all the faults that those people may have, the successes they had was that they're the ones who held the space for years. They're the ones who bore the brunt of facing the regime for years before I showed up. And so I think that there was going to be a lot more progress had we collaborated, or at least been open to collaborate with some of the voices and some of the programs that had been there before. I think we wouldn't have suffered some of the things we suffered, because we would have learned from the institutional memory of some of these groups. And so, to your second question, I would say that is an important part of building kind of a not only a credible voice, but something that outlives you, or something that is able to kind of stand the impacts of that the regimes will give to you. Is that if you exist not just as yourself, but you also find strength in other organizations that feed into you and you feed into them, and there's this kind of collaborative action, I think that goes further than just doing things on your own. And part of what I remember being at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I spoke there about one of the pieces that I was working on, because I was a fellow there, was this idea of a kind of a symbiotic existence or way of working between traditional civic society and social movements, or kind of these kind of movements born out of unexpected moments. Like, nobody could have predicted that we were going to suddenly show up and blow up and lead the whole country. But how could that moment have been one that existing civic society organizations could have supported, could have said, hey, why don't you guys focus on what you do best, and then we're going to support you with other learnings, or with training, or or with funding, because it costs money to do all of that stuff. So we missed out on some of those things. In fact, some of the positions we took were quite hardline in terms of trying to maintain the purity of the movement. We refused to touch any funding from anywhere. We refused to even build elaborate structures for the movement, fearing that the government would have something to aim at, because that's part of what we felt they were urging us to do. They kept saying, if you want to play in the political space, form an organization. Don't just say these things on video. Form an organization, have an office, and so forth. And I'm glad we didn't fall into that trap, to be honest. But I think there were ways of us having a sustainable presence through these other organizations who'd been there for a while. And I think both of us would have benefited from that.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really practical, useful advice. We're almost out of time. I'm just curious about what you think of the future of Zimbabwe. Mugabe is gone, but replaced by another dictator.
Oh man, it's tough. My last arrest in Zimbabwe was actually with the new dictator. I know. It's kind of like, once you get into it, the thing just becomes like an extreme sport, right? How many of these guys can I piss off, really? And that was really disappointing. I've got to tell you, the amount of wounding if I can actually use this terminology, the amount of soul or spiritual wounding that you go through when you have had a hope in something and you invest it in something, and then it suddenly vanishes immediately. I think that wounding is something that really hurt Zimbabweans when Emerson Mnangagwa, the new dictator, got into power, because the way Robert Mugabe left power felt like it was a collective effort. Now, there's a lot of arguments out there that it wasn't a collective effort, it was predetermined. The military was already doing their thing, which I believe is correct. I think the military was in on it and they were already pushing him out, but they needed us. There was a point at which I remember Robert Mugabe said, "I will not leave until the people say I must go." And I was like, oh, really? Because it just so happens I have the people's ear. And I'm sure we can get the message to you. And I remember, and I write about it in the book, when the military had kind of, barricaded Robert Mugabe in his house, and we wanted to march, and we said we've never had this opportunity to stand up to Robert Mugabe with our faces on the street, like a lot of us have. This is the moment we have been living for. And so we wrote a letter through some of the war veterans to the military, and we said, hey, we're not typically friends with you guys. Like, we know you, but here's the deal. If you guys will allow us to march on the street, we can get hundreds, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people on the street to march and say Robert Mugabe must go. And this is what we're asking, is that after this is done, that you would form a government of national unity with opposition politicians, with other civic leaders, and lead Zimbabwe through a transitional. And they're like, yeah, we'll talk about, obviously, yes, it'll happen. And we took that at face value, because we were desperate and there was not a lot of time to negotiate with people with guns, right? And so once we got on the street and once he was gone, and we turned around and we said, okay, he's gone. Shall we sit? And they're like, are you kidding me? Sit with who? With you? For what? Get out of here. And so Zimbabwe falls right back into this dictatorship with Emerson Mnangagwa. And my last protest was also a shutdown protest. The one we did with Robert Mugabe, we did again with Emerson Mnangagwa. This is in January of 2019, and that succeeded. But he went a step further in how he dealt with the situation than Robert Mugabe did. And what he did was he deployed the military on the streets. They beat people, they killed people. When I was in the maximum security prison under his arrest, I remember being in there with about 300 people that had just been taken from their homes and just accused because the government didn't know who else to arrest. And so there we are in prison with people that had been beaten and whipped and some shot. There was a 14-year-old boy that was with us, I remember, in that prison. And that became someone I advocated for. I remember actually saying, I'm not leaving until this boy leaves. And so it was hard for Zimbabweans to come to terms with the fact that we went from Robert Mugabe, who was the worst, to, like, the joke in Zimbabwe is we've discovered that there is a basement to rock bottom, right? So he's become worse. So the sense, I think, in Zimbabwe is this idea of one day we'll figure it out, but maybe not now. Now let's just do life. Now let's just figure out how to live from one day to the next, which is where the regime wants you to be anyway. But my belief is that in the same way that the liberators rose up in the 60s and 70s, in the same way that people like Morgan Tsvangirai, who's now late, began true political opposition to Robert Mugabe in the 1990s, in the same way that people like me then rose up also in 2016, there will be somebody, there will be a generation that will finally break this hold. So the hope is out there for Zimbabwe.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Peter. Thank you, everybody.